Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture on cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. So the first thing we want to kind of take a look at is what kind of relationship is established between a CBT therapist and their client. It's very collaborative in nature. Clients and their therapists will co-create uh, therapeutic goals together. Uh, and it's a very active and directive approach on the part of the therapist. And ultimately, sort of the foundational idea of this model is that, when there's some kind of event that occurs, and that gives us particular thoughts and beliefs, that gives us particular emotions that ultimately influence our behavior. Uh, Cognitive behavioral therapy is very much A plus B equals C. It's very easily measurable, and that makes it a very popular model in many community mental health settings. And it's very present focused. Average session length, I would say, uh, it could be as little as 6 sessions, but I think what I see as more of the norm is between 12 and 24 sessions for individual or group in community-based mental health. And CBT is focusing on specific behaviors. And it's important to note that cognitive theory sees thoughts as behaviors. And that's why cognitive theory and behavioral theory became CBT, because they so closely aligned, it was very easy to integrate the two. And now if you were to go Google, behavior theory, you're really only going to see matches for CBT. But the very beginning of CBT was Albert Ellis's REBT. I hope you saw the next session with Gloria because it's so different from Carl Rogers. And here we have his ABC model. Some kind of situation happens, I have a belief, and then there's a consequence. So, for example, let's say there is a big party coming up. I am not real comfortable engaging in small talk, and so I get scared, my emotional reaction, and as a consequence, I decide not to go to the party, even though I wanted to go. So this would be one way to look at this issue about having some anxiety of going to the party, an example of the ABC model. It's highly didactic, meaning that a therapist in CBT often, could look like a teacher, and definitely engages in the same kind of way, because you have to be very active and directive in your approach here, because you're going to always teach your client something about their experience to empower them to be able to make changes. And here we have the full ABC model here with the addition of disputing, the irrational belief and cognitive restructuring. So, this party could occur. My belief might be that I'm not going to feel comfortable uh, engaging in small talk. I decide not to go to the party, but I'm feeling pretty bad about it. So using this model, I might dispute or challenge my thoughts around the idea that I'm not going to be able to talk to people or engage in good small talk. And Ellis identified 11 irrational beliefs, and two that I think tend to come to therapy more often than not is number one, an adult human must be loved or approved of by almost everyone. That's very common. Core belief being that I am unlovable, and so I seek out love and approval, pretty much constantly. And that the best way to handle a dangerous or fear-producing event is to worry about it and dwell on it, that I'll have some sense of control if I engage that way. Those are two very common irrational beliefs that come up in therapy. And so through this model, the REBT model, where we would work on disputing irrational beliefs, we would provide our client with homework. Again, and I really enjoy this aspect of the cognitive approach that recognizes that 1 hour in therapy is not going to lead to change. The client needs to be engaging in the behavior change, the thought change process throughout the week in order for there to be, a new way of engaging with their suffering. Bibliotherapy, reading, asking clients to read different books or websites or resources. I will ask clients to do this pretty much all the time. I mean, whatever they're suffering with, I want them to know that they can also find some information, and I will work with them then to evaluate the quality of that information. But again, to empower them to know that they can find, information about what they're suffering with, and that can help to build some resilience. Psychoeducational methods are very popular. Given everything that I've just shared, that probably makes sense, right? We need to be able to provide information to our clients about their experiences. And psychoeducation as a method began actually with clients who were diagnosed with schizophrenia, and there were many studies that have shown that individuals who engage in psychoeducational groups that have schizophrenia have much better outcomes than those that don't. And so now you'll see psychoeducational groups just about everything. And then REBT uses a couple of different ideas here. So we have rational emotive imagery. And with REI, the client is asked to close their eyes and they have to recreate their problematic situation in their mind's eye. And then they experience the difficult emotion, whatever comes up for them. So, I would think about this going to this party, and I'm imagining myself maybe being isolated and all alone, not having somebody to talk to. And then so that's coming up for us. So that's coming up for us, and then we're going to look to change our self-talk to help us to change our perspective on the situation. Rational emotive imagery is empowering, it's effective, it's part of a multimodal approach, which includes hypnotherapy. All of these could be used within REBT. Ellis was known for having a great sense of humor. Role playing is very important. It's one of the reasons that we do a lot of role playing and counseling. It helps us to learn skills. There's a lot of ways in which we're being trained that we are then going to help our clients to gain the same skills. Shame attacking exercises. So Ellis wants to expose the person to the anxiety provoking situation over and over and over again until it loses its control over the client. So for example, Ellis was fearful of going up to women and asking them out. So he gave himself the homework of going up to 100 different women and asking them out regardless of the response that he received. And of course, CBT incorporates much of what we talked about in terms of behavior therapy approaches and procedures. And REBT is great in groups. I will often bring an ABC model worksheet into my groups and ask clients to fill it out. Then I break them down into groups of 2 and have them talk to each other about how they filled out the ABC model. And then often at that point, then the disputing and coming up with new ideas, we do that as a large group. So just some examples of how that you might apply this. And again, we want to see, what's working for clients and what's not with their homework. So sometimes I'll begin a group with a check-in, like, I want you to tell me on a scale of 1 to 10, how did it go with the homework this week? 10 being it went awesome, I had no problem with it, I loved it. 1 being I didn't do it at all, I hated it, it didn't work for me. And it's great for social skills in particular. REBT is used in anger management. It very much aligns with relapse prevention in addictions, assertiveness training, communication skills, all of these topics that I have here. You could find psychoeducational REBT groups in any community mental health setting. I mean, it's just that popular. And for anybody that doesn't know, we have the Beck Institute here in Philadelphia, and I recommend checking out their website. Just Google the Beck Institute, and it'll come up for you. And Aaron Beck's cognitive theory, here we look at distorted beliefs and how that can lead us to have thought errors. So, so let me give an example. So, I think a very common one, a common distorted thought is black and white thinking. So everything is going to be all bad or all good. And the truth is that most things have some aspect of good and some aspect of bad. Our own judgments of what constitutes good and bad as well. And one of the ways that we might support a client who's engaging in all or nothing thinking is A, educating them about distorted beliefs, and then B, providing some opportunities to challenge those thoughts with Socratic questioning. And Socratic questioning is a critical part here of engaging in Aaron Beck's model. It helps the client to gain different perspective on whatever they're suffering with. So all or nothing thinking, black and white thinking is very common. And let's give an example. So I'm the worst public speaker ever. Well, how do you know that? What makes you believe that? Have you received that feedback before? I want you to role play that for me right now. Let's do it together. And start to help the client to question some of the validity of the way in which they're thinking. And here are just some examples of different cognitive distortion types that can happen. So arbitrary inference, drawing conclusions from insufficient or no evidence, selective abstraction, drawing conclusions on the basis of just one of many elements of a situation. Then there's overgeneralization, so making sweeping conclusion based on a single event. This one I think is popping up more because of social media on some level. Magnification and exaggerating the importance of an undesirable event. Personalization, attributing negative feelings of others to oneself. So just, a couple examples to show you here. And I think it's not important for you to memorize these as it is to know that these exist and that you can find all kinds of worksheets online that identify different cognitive distortions because there's been some newer ones that have been identified since they were originally developed, and to have clients reflect on themselves and the ways in which they think and the ways in which they use some of these distortions. And one very famous aspect of the CBT approach is this idea of the negative cognitive triad. And essentially, the cognitive triad is used to describe the negative views of someone who has depression about themselves, the world, and the future. So it's just, once they're kind of, I call it getting stuck in the loop. Once they're stuck in the loop, it's hard to get out. And so part of helping them to get out of the negative triad here is to help them identify the ways in which they're engaging in distorted thinking and begin to challenge some of that. I will say that some of the newer third wave approaches to behavioral, to CBT, such as acceptance and commitment therapy. These kinds of approaches, dialectical behavioral therapy, rather than challenging the view, they might work on radical acceptance. So, well, here the example is I'm a lousy person. The world is a negative place where bad things are bound to happen to me. The world is bleak and it isn't going to improve. So if that's all true, then, what does that mean? And have they found other times in their life when they haven't felt that way, and what was different at that point? So just helping them to recognize the ways in which their thinking is influencing their worldview and the ways in which they're behaving. Again, the length of CBT can really vary. Again, a psychoeducational group might meet once, but CBT for depression and panic disorder, typically 16 to 20. 12 sessions, I see very few clients that go for that short amount of time, only if their insurance won't let them go further. And I will just bring up one limitation of the approach here, since we're looking at the amount of sessions, and then that is that CBT is great for symptom reduction, but doesn't necessarily produce long-term changes for the client. They may re-experience depression, and so it's important for the client to understand that even if we're just getting together now for a couple of sessions, they need more sessions in the future if they find themselves struggling again. Then we have Donald Meckenbaum's cognitive behavior modification. And this is all about changing the way the client talks to himself or herself, their self. So, if and self-talk really works. This is why I often get clients to do affirmations daily, like twice a day, to change the way that they're engaging in their self-talk. So if they're constantly barraging themselves with negative judgments, just to help them even gain that awareness can help to change their outlook. And in Meckenbaum's stress inoculation training, SIT, there's 3 kind of steps here to observing negative self-talk. So, and stress inoculation therapy is very similar to relapse prevention methods in addictions as well. So this is an approach that helps the client to prepare to handle stressful situations that might be, that are going to cause the client stress in therapy. And there's 3 approaches. There's an initial conceptualization phase, and the therapist will provide the client with psychoeducation, talk about cognitive distortions, look at ways to assess their stress reactions, look at any ways they engage in poor coping. And then the second phase, the skills acquisition and rehearsal. This is where different skills are taught, such as relaxation, emotional regulation, problem solving, socialization skills, that kind of thing. And then at the end is application and follow through. And so making sure there's plenty of time for the client to practice these skills in stressful situations over time. Typically it's about 20 minutes, but it can be much longer amount of time spent in session. It just depends. And you're going to do this maybe for 8 to 15 sessions or 3 to 12 months. It really depends on the client. And then there's cognitive narrative approach to CBT. And by the way, these are just the sort of the variations that your textbook has highlighted. There's actually many more variations of CBT. So, but this approach integrates narrative approaches, where you're going to be looking at how the client constructs and engages in storytelling. And then you are going to kind of poke holes and draw out and point out strength-based areas of their story in an attempt to restory the way that they're thinking about their suffering, as a way to address the cognitive distortions. So REBT, CBT, it is very active and directive. Some people love that, and some people hate it. Some people like the worksheets, some people hate them. And at the end of the day, there's a therapist for everybody. So go ahead, in terms of your own development, and think about how and in what ways this approach works for you or doesn't. Some of the criticisms are sometimes its emphasis on, all things rational and cognitive can kind of overlook emotional aspects, areas of cultural differences. In class this week, we talked about, or you'll be viewing this next week. So the previous week, we talked about how there's a opportunity that you could blame the client unnecessarily, or they may view that. So, for example, something has happened to me. Let's say I've experienced a microaggression in the classroom, and I'm struggling with that. I'm talking to my counselor about it. I'm feeling sad. Well, I have an actual reason to be sad. It's important not to uh, point out how that might be a cognitive distortion. So it's just some areas, some points where you need to be aware of its limitations. That said, I have to tell you, CBT is really popular. Uh, a lot of clients I find who aren't particularly insight oriented really like CBT because it tells them exactly what to do and when. And for new clinicians, you can essentially walk yourself through what to do in session. And I really encourage you to do that. I own all kinds of workbooks and worksheets and use them all the time in group and therapy. And it's really quite the norm. The only aspect of CBT that you also want to be aware of is that some people with learning disabilities or who might just not be literate, this could also bring up some shame for them. So I always also, if I'm going to use something that's more cognitive heavy, worksheets, that kind of thing, I will read whatever that, worksheet or thing is in the group or in the session also, as to not make an assumption or make my client feel like they need to ask for support in that way. However, I also invite them to ask me for support in that way. So just some, aspects around the theory that you want to be mindful of. There is lots of good resources on CBT online. If you're really feeling this approach, I highly recommend going and looking at different therapists and the ways in which they engage in CBT. I always think it's easier to decide how you want to be relationally in a session by seeing what others are doing. There's that role playing, right, or modeling. And I hope everyone has a great week, and thanks a lot for listening.